This is a resumption of meeting number 32 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on National Defence, which was started on Friday, May the 21st, 2021. I won't go through all of the preamble. We'll keep it short so we can get our full 2 hours in today. If interpretation is lost, would you please let me know immediately, because I think it's very important that everyone be able to participate to the fullest extent possible. All right? Okay, before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. All right, when speaking, okay, I'm reminding myself again, please speak slowly and clearly for our good interpreters so they can do their good work that we're counting upon them to do. And when you're not speaking, your mic should be on mute. With regard to a speaking list, the committee clerk and I will do the best we can to maintain a consolidated order of speaking for all members, whether they're participating virtually or in person. Okay, pursuant to Standing Order 106.4, the committee is meeting today to consider a request received by the clerk and submitted by 4 members of the committee to discuss their request for additional witnesses for the study of addressing sexual misconduct issues in the Canadian Armed Forces, including the allegations against former Chief of the Defence Staff, Jonathan Vance. I will now open the floor for debate. Can I get my chat, please? Mr. Bazan, I think you're up first.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I don't believe we need to move any motions back on the floor since it's a resumption of the last meeting. So I'll just say this, that again, just want to ask committee to move quickly to accept this motion so that we can bring in Zita Estrabas as the only person who can shed light on the contradictions that we've heard from numerous witnesses, including Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, Katie Telford, from former Clerk of the Privy Council, Michael Warnock, from former Prime Ministerial Advisor, Elder Marquez, and from the Minister of National Defence, Harjit Sajjan himself, who have all different versions of who reported in the allegations that came before the Minister of Defence on March the 1st, 2018, as was presented by former Ombudsman Gary Walbourne. Now, the Liberal members of this committee have been talking out the clock. You, Madam Chair, have been suspending meetings at will, and all that has obstructed the work of this committee, and it's blocked key witnesses from appearing. This has gone on for days on end, and it's time to put an end to it. So I would implore members of the Liberal Party who sit on this committee to actually, let's get down to the brass tacks of passing this motion, dealing with this in a timely manner so that we can hear from Zita Estrabas, get her summoned to this committee for 2 hours, and then we can get back to work on the report and have it done before we actually rise for the summer break. We only have 5 weeks left, and my calculation is that is going to be at best 9 meetings unless we find a way to add more meetings or sit into the summer so we can table our reports, not just on sexual misconduct in the armed forces, but also our study on COVID and the work done by the Canadian Armed Forces, as well as looking at mental health. Those reports are also sitting in draft form, and I know that many committee members would like to see those tabled as well. So instead of having endless hours of debate and filibuster, instead of obstructing the work of this committee, I'd ask that Liberal members allow this committee to vote on this motion along with the amendment from Mr. Barceló, from Xavier, that we can get back to the basis of what we need to do, which is uncover what happened with the allegations against General Vance, contrast that to the allegations brought against Admiral Art MacDonald, and see whether or not there was a cover-up done and orchestrated by Katie Telford and Minister Sajjan by not telling the Prime Minister about these allegations back in 2018. The women and men who service in uniform expect results. They expect this report to come out, and any efforts to stall this work is obstruction by members who continue to filibuster and not allow this motion to come to a vote. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Bazan. I'm reminded by the clerk that we're still on the amendment. We're on the block amendment to the motion. The clerk is about to send out to you the official interpretation, the translation of the. I know there were some questions last Friday about the interpretation, so we wanted to make sure we had an official version for you. So you should find that in your mailbox shortly. Okay, so that's what's coming your way right now. Okay, you're up next, Mr. Garrison, please.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I must start by saying that I was extremely disappointed in the way that the last meeting concluded with an arbitrary exit from the chair by yourself. And I think it's part of a pattern that Mr. Bazan has pointed out of obstruction of the work of this committee by continual filibuster, by canceling meetings, and by suspending meetings. The attempt by Liberal members to frustrate the majority of this committee in getting the witnesses we need to provide answers as to why there was no effective action on sexual misconduct in the military, and in particular, why there was no investigation and no action on General Vance, remains outstanding. And it's a disservice to the survivors of sexual misconduct in the military for the Liberal members of this committee to continue to argue that they want to get on to the report for survivors while they're very filibustering frustrates getting on to that report. It's like we live in some alternate reality here where burning up time in committee doesn't keep us from getting the work done. I just don't understand the Liberals' position other than that they do not wish to have the answers to the questions that we're asking here about why senior leaders either did not understand the severity of sexual misconduct or wanted to somehow protect senior officers who were accused of sexual misconduct. I'm not going to go on at length, but in any institution where you have so many senior leaders who've had to exit their positions as a result of sexual misconduct, there would be a crisis. And the board of that corporation or institution would be demanding accountability from those responsible. In this case, because it's the Canadian Armed Forces, the Canadian Parliament and this committee are the board who has to demand that accountability. And again, we heard many times the Liberals using the word finger pointing. Accountability is not finger pointing. It's identifying the people who should have acted and failed to act and identifying the reasons that happened so that as we go forward and promise Canadian men and women who serve that this won't happen again, that there's some assurance that we know why the action didn't take place before. The promises will be not taken seriously by anybody if we don't figure out why the previous promises weren't kept. And so, like Mr. Bazan, I would implore the members of the Liberal Committee to give up their filibustering. In the time they take to filibuster, we could have easily dealt with witnesses like Ms. Astrovas, who many times the minister and the Prime Minister's office have pointed to as the key person in understanding what was conveyed from the minister's office to the Prime Minister's office. And that's the key question we still need to answer here in order to establish who's accountable for the lack of effective action. So I would urge us to go to a vote on the amendment and then on the main motion expeditiously to schedule Ms. Astrovas' appearance, and then we can get on to finishing the report on sexual misconduct. And then, though I would prefer to dealt with them earlier, we can also get a chance to deal with the other two important reports on COVID and the Canadian Armed Forces and mental health in the Canadian military. There's important work to do here, and I implore the Liberals to stop obstructing that work.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Garrison. On to Mr. Spengeman, please.
Madam Chair, thanks very much. It's good to be with you, colleagues. It feels a little bit like deja vu, and I've said consistently from the outset that there are two components to our work, and they are of equal importance. But in terms of the real heavy lifting on culture change, it is probably the more challenging problem, and everybody's pointed to it. Every single witness has said that the culture needs to be changed. That culture pre-existed with informed speculation, the tenure of General Vance as CDS. it requires the recommendations that, as I've alluded to in other testimony in other sessions, a lot of countries have gone through or are going through. And in parallel with that, we have a number of important cases that have come forward, including 2 former chiefs of defense staffs and most recently Major General Fortin. We can see each of these cases as being emblematic of a much deeper cultural problem. To use a metaphor that might not perfectly fit maybe the tip of the iceberg, unless we look at the iceberg itself and take it apart and look at the recommendations that will really change the trajectory of the Canadian Forces as an employer within which sexual misconduct no longer happens, we will not do our work. And yes, the opposition is perfectly within their right to chase after additional testimony. In this case, I think we have heard testimony that's starting to be very consistent with respect to where accountabilities lie. There's messages that have come from witnesses, including the former chief of staff of the former Minister of Defense, Ray Novak, who has said that it is inappropriate in our democracy to involve elected officials, including ministers or prime ministers, in investigative processes with respect to misconduct. There's clarity on that. There's also clarity with respect to the systematicity of this problem. There's clarity with respect to challenges of the relating to the chain of command, challenges with respect to demographics in the Canadian Forces, challenges with respect to the long existence of this issue. And I think it would be a disservice to Canadian women if this committee, prior to the summer recess, were not in a position to put forward recommendations that aren't simply approved with a simple up or down vote, but that have been subjected to discussion, debate among the committee, and prioritized and identified as the ones that are able to really make progress in a most expeditious manner in parallel with the work of Madam Justice Arbour. Let me take the committee back to 2015, and I've referred to this previously, but maybe it bears repeating briefly in the context of this amendment that's now before us. And I'm referring to an article published on the 22nd of April 2021 in the Ottawa Citizen by David Pugliese, where it is reported that General Jonathan Vance boasted that he was, and the quote is, untouchable by military police. And further in the article, it is referred to the fact that he claims to have owned, again, the word owned in quotation marks, the Canadian Forces National Investigative Service. And then we have received much more recent evidence that's before the committee, and there may well be witnesses that we could bring in to illuminate this evidence more closely, but in my estimation, that is not where the real work is, and I'll explain that in a minute. According to that evidence, there was an investigation underway in 2015 at the time of appointment of General Vance under the former Conservative government. And shortly after General Vance's appointment, that investigation came to a halt. And if you take that evidence in conjunction with the testimony or the General's reported statement through media testimony that he owned the investigative service, that is really where the systematic nature of this problem lies. In 2015, how could the head or then appointed head of the Canadian Forces be in such an asymmetrical position of power and so removed from parliamentary oversight that he could boast about owning the Canadian Forces National Investigative Service? If it's true that General Vance was able to bring an investigation to a close at that time, that is an issue that every member of this committee across party lines should be seized with and should look at. And in that respect, it's not irrelevant who comes forward in terms of complaining against whom. That is incredibly important, but it just points to a much more systematic problem that we need to solve. And we have to weigh that against the timeline towards completion of this parliamentary session, the need to put out a report that has substance, that has recommendations. We have had testimony with respect to ministerial accountability and the ministerial roles involved in this government. With respect to Jonathan Vance, the minister himself, Minister of Defense, came and testified for 6 hours. We have had staff from PCO. We have had Katie Telford from the Prime Minister's office, Elder Marquez, former PMO staff. We've had extensive testimony that pointed to the conclusion that it is not appropriate to involve either the Minister of Defense or Prime Minister in investigative processes relating to the Chief of Defense Staff. The systematic nature of the problem is his reported ownership of the authority that is now investigating and presumably potentially wasn't at the time of his appointment, or its investigation was truncated because or shortly after his appointment took place. That's a problem that I think we should all be concerned about. And I haven't seen the symmetry within the thinking of this committee to look at these questions, to look at the recommendations. Yes, we've heard testimony. Yes, we've got a pile of recommendations that have been put forward. But what is this committee going to say in June of this year to give confidence to the serving women, the former serving women of the Canadian Forces, the men who are allies, Canadians of all genders, Canadians of all walks of life who wish to serve in the Canadian Forces and feel that they can't, or the ones who are already serving and feel that they don't have a voice, that they can't come forward, or if they do come forward, that their careers and their future is in doubt because they've taken the step of speaking out. Those are the systematic questions that are exemplified in the cases that we've looked at, in the cases that we've studied, that are properly investigated by independent authorities. I think we have gathered the political and policy evidence that's behind them that we need to make recommendations urgently to take our country forward. And again, I've pointed to a number of other militaries similar in nature to Canada's, in the sense that they are militaries that are subject to liberal democracy and parliamentary oversight, that at the very same time that we're talking about this are struggling, and in some cases have put forward recommendations and processes that have been illuminating and quite helpful and potentially could be emulated. So I've injected those thoughts into the committee's discussion and will continue to do so. We've got some work ahead, and I think we need to focus on the iceberg without in any way slighting the significance of the victims of the cases that are before us and that we've studied in the form of individual allegations that have been made. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Spengeman. On to Monsieur Barcelou-Duval, s'il vous plaît.
Please. Thank you, Madam Chair. I also wanted to take the floor today. I'm not sure if committee members have had the chance to think about their actions, or at least the way that they've been acting on this committee for the past few weeks. But this systematic practice of filibustering, in my opinion, is not beneficial to the committee, nor to the benefit of all of the other financial and other resources at the House of Commons, and those resources are paid for by taxpayers. If our constituents were here today, if citizens from our ridings, for example, were here, if our taxpayers were here watching us today, would they really be proud of us? In my opinion, at least, I feel that if I were a taxpayer, and if I had been attending this committee for the past weeks, I would be ashamed, because it would seem to me that these are school children not trying to work together to move forward. And if this systematic practice of filibustering on the part of the government, if it is used every time that opposition parties want to hear from new witnesses in such a serious study, well, I think it is disgraceful and very regrettable. I hope my colleagues around the table have had the opportunity to reflect on this. If not, I hope they will have the chance to think about it. I sincerely implore them to end this waste of time so that the committee can move forward with its work. Thank you.
All right, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Signal, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I would agree. I would implore that we stop this waste of time by debating motion after motion, witness after witness that are unnecessary, that are delaying the study. And so I implore Mr. Bizan to remove the motion, which, as he probably knows, has a number of problems in it, doesn't bring forward witnesses that we need if we want to go further into the who, how, and where and when, which I'll go into much, and when we get to the main motion in great depth. But for the exact reason that people expect the report to come out. So keep doing motions that recall witnesses that have been here for hours that have nothing to add to the debate, to calling a witness whose potential testimony has already been dealt with, and then a motion that wouldn't allow us put a stop to looking at each recommendation and debating them and actually coming out with a serious report. I mean, we had an email, an anonymous email that no one knew what was in because the person wanted their privacy and they were allowed their privacy. So it's incredible that instead of dealing with the major problems to help the people in the military, that Mr. Bazan would keep calling witnesses related to that email and not all the great testimony we've had from experts and victims. And as if you want to go back, I want to get on to dealing with those serious issues. But if you want to go back to the who, why, and where, and then, as Mr. Garrison said, the serious issues are related to the appointment of General Vance, and as Mr. Garrison said, when people should have acted to and failed to act, and there was potential investigations. One which apparently was there was pressure to stop on the day that General Vance was appointed, and another one that I think a quote from someone, the vice chair in the military said, Vice Chief of Defense Staff said it was a mystery who investigated the investigation seen as it didn't occur. So those are the serious questions if people want to go back to that. But I don't want to go back to that. I want to get on to the issues of helping the people in the military. And as Mr. Barsulaus said, why are members acting the way they are? By bringing witness after witness, trying to recall witnesses, extending it on this, one email that's already been fully investigated as far as it could go because the person didn't want to let any of the details forward. We only have so much time in government. As everyone knows that's been in government, that there's a huge number of federal departments and agencies and things that have to be dealt with. So there are rare points in time when you can actually get the item that you want to make progress on. And so I think this is one of those points in time when we have a minister that's supportive of this, of dealing with this, and all the committee members that are supportive of dealing with sexual misconduct in the military. That's what we should be dealing with. And I won't go, but I could in the future, if need be, explain or outline all the times the quotes from the minister over the last several months as to how he says there's much more needs to be done, and how there's no tolerance, and over and over and again. And now, unfortunately, it's also been said in this debate that nothing has been done, or that nothing of consequence has been done. And so, in fairness to the members of CAF and DND that have been working so hard to try and address this serious issue, I think we have to dispose of that misinformation, because there have some things been done. There has to be a lot more, obviously, as Mr. Garrison outlined, the number of, and I've outlined in a number of committees, the hundreds of complaints that have occurred. Much more needs to be done, but it's also not fair to suggest that nothing's been done. And so I'm going to go through some of those things to give credit where credit's due. The government has announced an external review of the creation of the Chief of Professional Conduct and Culture position, as well as initiatives around peer support, the expansion of SMRC's reach across Canada, and work on implementation of Bill C-77. DIAN and CAF also released a joint DM-CDS initiating directive, which has provided our defense team members, veterans, observers, and all Canadians much needed clarity on DND CAF's vision for Lieutenant General Kerrigan's position and what she'll be empowered to do. Going forward, one of General Kerrigan's first areas of focus is developing a plan for engagement and consultation, including targeted focus groups in coordination with our colleagues in public affairs to ensure that we keep up the momentum on listening. And then recently in budget, in the budget that we're now debating in the House, $232.2 million over 5 years has been set aside, plus $33.5 million per year ongoing to address sexual misconduct and gender-based violence in the military and to support survivors. And these funds will be used for gender-based violence prevention, fully funded, $33.9 million over 2 years. Internal support to victims, including access to legal advice, to expand the contribution program to support community-based sexual assault service provides, and peer support pilot, online and in person, and I'll talk to that a bit later. There's additional conduct items that are fully funded, $33 million over 2 years to support $15 million for increased investment in the SMRC, which I'll talk about later as well, $15 million for external oversight, and $3 million for external assistance with training. And then there's investments from existing reference levels, $158.5 million for and this includes to the implementation of Bill C-65 and the workplace harassment and violence prevention regulations, which I'll talk a bit about later, support of development of character assessment and training, additional support to enhance the military justice system, personnel support to base commanders, development of the departmental litigation oversight capability, and we've talked about oversight a lot in this committee, upgrade data management and tracking into a single system. We've talked about that and having that as a recommendation. And then additional items that D&D and CAF are going to respond to the government with suggestions related to the CAF childcare program and the clinical occupation and deployment health needs of women in uniform. I also said I was going to get back to the work, and the Deputy Minister mentioned that a lot had to be done, but she also mentioned there were good things being done. One of the things she mentioned was the advancing initiatives related to the SMRC, the Gender-Based Violence National Action Plan initiatives, the regional expansion of SMRC services, including response and support coordination program, the expansion of support services to include service to DND public service employees and veterans, and the increasing need of virtual training options and targeted prevention training. And the staffing of positions for that is also underway. And I'll get back to SMRC a little bit later, and also the next time that I get to speak. Another item of progress, so, it's not fair to say that nothing has been done or accomplished. Bill C-65 implementation is underway. In the departmental approach, there's work on implementation of the Workplace Harassment and Violence Prevention, WHVP. Legislation continues to progress. Direction and guidance on the WHVP workplace assessment is to be released by August in 2021. The service level agreement to provide access to WHVP training for CAF members is being finalized, and training will be available online by June 2021. and mandatory training for public service employees is progressing well. As March 31st this year, 40% of employees and 13% of
order,
managers.
Madam Chair.
Go ahead, Mr. Bazan.
We're debating the amendment proposed that's on the floor right now. I appreciate the update that Mr. Bagnall is giving as to what's been happening in the Canadian Armed Forces, but that isn't relevant to our study and the witnesses or the witness that we wish to call. So I'd ask that he get on point, and perhaps he may want to talk about why he's complicit in the cover-up by Liberals and what are they trying to hide by not having Zita Estrabas appear at committee.
Madam Chair, I think it was actually that member that's said that nothing's been done. And also that member also in his preamble veered totally away from the amendment. So I will just carry on. If he didn't want to know what's being done, then he shouldn't have said that nothing's being done by CAF and DND in previous
I said there's been
comments
nothing being done by the Liberals. It's different.
related to this motion. So to give credit where credit's due and the things we've done, also to supplement the Employee Assistance Program, the WHVP Center of Expertise is establishing additional assistance for employees affected by harassment or workplace violence. The CAF approach, while CAF is not subject to Canada Labor Code, the CAF is working on a harassment modernization initiative to further align and integrate accountability and prevention components of the WHVP with the CAF system. The stage 1 of CAF harassment modernization initiative is nearing completion, including through the issuance of VCDS initiating directive, development of tools and supporting documents for the relevant DAOD on harassment prevention, and establishment of a governance structure and working group. In stage 2, focus on the development of CAF harassment and vision statement and development of additional tools and guides. Consultation and options analysis is being finalized. This work will take into consideration and align with the work of Bill C-65, Bill C-77, negotiations on policy measures in class actions for NET, and the evolution of the Chief Professional Conduct and Culture Organization. Now I'll go on to military sexual trauma. And also in relation to Mr. Bazan's last comment, I wonder why his motion, he won't change it to bring forward the real witnesses of the serious problems that have now arisen since the motion was designed, that has been brought forward by the press with the serious potential cover-up related to the investigations during the time of the appointment of General Vance. So on military sexual trauma, MST, we've constantly heard from stakeholders and those affected by sexual misconduct that they want sexual trauma connected with military service to be acknowledged and recognized as such and supported accordingly. And so working with Veterans Affairs Canada and the SMRC and external stakeholders, we're working on developing a definition of sexual trauma connected with military service. This work is being done in full consultation with survivor groups, as well as with members of the SMR, External Advisory Council, and others. While not a critical term, we acknowledge the injury is associated with sexual trauma connected to military service. And we're working with VAC to ensure that there continues to be policy alignment between the two departments, particularly in the delivery of supports and benefits to those affected. I want to talk about peer support now. This committee has heard this from witnesses, which is where our focus should be on the survivors and helping them. And they've asked for peer support, and work is underway, but I hope we have recommendations. And when we get to the main motion, I will go into a lot about the recommendations, because the motion doesn't allow or allows for a cutoff, a debate on those recommendations. So as announced, DND and CAF and Veterans Affairs Canada are working on developing professionally co-facilitated peer support program. Another initiative is a high priority for the stakeholders, as we heard from the witnesses. And this is funded in budget 2021. Online, because of our present situation and the direction of the world, we need to do more things online. So SMRC and CAF Transition Group and VAC are working to adapt an existing online peer support mobile application that was developed for the Canadian public safety personnel. Process of adaptation, modification, and implementation of the app is expected to take several months. And of course, this is so important because our military are stationed around the world. So there's also support for individual people that CAF and DND have worked so hard on. And our government is not, as I said, done. We've got a lot more to done. And as I've said at every meeting, that's what we should be working on, recommendations on those procedures. But some progress has been made. And as we know, we need a lot more. But we're going to continue to consult with the experts, some of which we had before our committee, and those have been affected by sexual misconduct. But I want to highlight some of the measures that are already in place and accessible to the DND and CAF members. In SMRC, as I mentioned earlier, the offers members confidential support 24/7 anywhere in the world. And I'm happy to say that the budget 2021 is increased support for that. And we heard from a number of witnesses how that wasn't the be all and end all, but it was certainly providing helpful services. And it operates outside the military chain of command. And reporting directly to the Deputy Minister, it allows affected persons to access support in a confidential manner. SMRC offers many programs and services to help affected members. One of them is the Response and Support Coordination Program, which helps CAF members navigate systems from the moment they make contact with SMRC until they decide they no longer require support. At every step of the way, SMRC personnel accompany those affected by sexual violence, providing whatever support may be necessary. CAF members seeking information about the reporting process can contact SMRC to explore their options while remaining anonymous. And civilian members of the defense team can also access support through SMRC, as well as the Employee Assistance Program. But through SMRC is an important tool, we haven't got this right yet. And that's why the defense team is in the midst of a top to bottom change of its institutional culture. This is the right thing to do. It's not just a moral imperative, it is also vital to the success of the Canadian Armed Forces now and into the future. And we've heard that time and time again. I think every committee member knows that that's a critical problem that we have to deal with and come up with solutions, and what a number of things are being done already, but obviously much needs to be done. And it was great to hear the acting chief of defense staff, I think it was yesterday or the day before, so open to hearing outside expertise to make sure this is done right, that the moral, that the culture change that's been so hard to do. I mean, this isn't new. It's been there for decades upon decades upon decades. So it's not easy to change quickly, and just making paper changes is not enough. And that's why it's all these initiatives and why we should be discussing the complexity of that culture change and how we do it. So that's why the Madame Arbour announcement will be helpful. And culture change is mentioned right in the amendment to this motion, which is why this is important discussion as well. And so the initial independent external comprehensive review led by the former Supreme Court Justice Louise Arbour is very important. The Premier Deschamps report, obviously all the recommendations haven't been implemented. Much more needs to be done, but this, Madame Arbour will provide the roadmap, a suggested way to actually achieve the things that Madame Deschamps said need to be done. It'll look into harassment and sexual conduct in both DND and CAF, and we'll examine the policies, procedures, programs, practices, and culture within national defense and make recommendations for improvement. And from that, we'll learn what did not work from all these things that I'm talking about today, of the processes that are in place, and build on what did work and see what did not work and why it did not work. It's been noted, and as I've said in previous meetings, a number of things was very puzzling. There was a number of good things in place, but why were they not working? Why did they still lead to the number of cases, the hundreds upon hundreds of cases that Mr. Garrison and I have referred to in previous meetings? So as noticed in the terms of reference, Madame Arbour will be delivering a work plan within 30 days of the effective date of her contract. I just wanted to mention one other thing about the peer support program. Is the budget 2021 also includes funding to enhance support, other support services, including access to free, independent legal advice that will help enable CAF members to access support without making a formal complaint. And then another step forward, once again, credit where credit's due. Things are being done, and they have to be acknowledged. Lieutenant General Jeannie Kerrigan has been announced to begin a new role as the Chief Professional Conduct and Culture, which will unify, integrate, and coordinate all policies, programs, and activities that currently address systemic misconduct across culture change. She's moved quickly in her new role and is actively working on building a core team around her. She's already begun to turn her attention to key issues, including developing an outreach and consultation plan to continue hearing from defense team members, veterans, and stakeholders, and mapping resources and reporting processes to get a clearer sense of what currently exists to inform future efforts to streamline. Another step that's been done is, in addition to these steps, our government is following through on its commitment to consult with victims of service offenses, which will inform the development of the regulations needed to implement the Declaration of Victim Rights from Bill C-77. The Department of National Defense has engaged directly with victims groups and will be soon launching an online questionnaire to collect anonymous feedback from DND employees and CAF members. And certainly we've heard from victims of both those groups, and it'll be really good to get that anonymous feedback where they have no fear of retribution or reprisal, which we've heard is what I would say is one of the top three things that this committee should be coming up with recommendations to help the minister that's open to making major change at this critical time when we could actually make improvements. Our government has heard the victims groups who have generously devoted their time and energy to sharing lived experiences and feedback with us and also with committees. We have heard them and we are taking action. This is what the survivors and experts who have testified at this committee and the Committee on the Status of Women have been advocating for. There's some other sources available to CAF members to access counseling, advice, and other support services. And this may be one of the things that the report of Madame Arbour comes up with, that members aren't aware of all these supports, and maybe that's one of the reasons they haven't been as effective as they should be. But there's the CAF medical centers, there's the military chaplains, there's the CF member assistant program, there's the Military Family Resource Center and the Family Information Center. There's also complaint management centers. These are another avenue for members to bring forward concerns or incidents through one of the 16 complaint management centers located across the country under the Integrated Conflict and Complaint Management Program. This service combines harassment, grievance, and alternate dispute resolution approaches in a streamlined fashion and they report, track, and resolve complaints of inappropriate behavior like sexual harassment. If the nature of the sexual misconduct requires involvement of the military, police, and justice system, there are supports for CAF members during this process as well. Another support is sexual offense response teams. The military police have established 6 sexual offense response teams trained to handle sexual misconduct cases appropriately and with empathy. These teams are sensitive to survivors and help them connect with other resources and support systems they need. And I'm certainly looking forward to survivors and complainants getting much better treatment than some of the witnesses that we heard. And hopefully these new centers and the training will have far more appropriate support and training for survivors. In addition, the Director of Military Prosecutions has established the Sexual Misconduct Action Response Team made up of specially trained prosecutors. Their role, again, is to make sure survivors are treated with compassion and understanding, that they receive information and the support they need through the military justice proceedings. Supporting survivors of sexual misconduct is essential, and that's why steps have been taken to ensure support is available and provided from the moment a person seeks advice or counsel through investigation and prosecution. Along with the future changes, these steps will help build a safe and inclusive workplace where all people are supported and treated with respect. We're creating a defense workplace where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. We hope all our colleagues will join us in this effort. We'll build the right systems so that when an incident occurs, members of the Canadian Armed Forces and Department of National Defense have access to a process that is sensitive, fair, and compassionate. So CAF and D&D are listening, they're learning, they're taking action to create an environment where sexual misconduct is never minimized, excused, or ignored. We owe it to the men and women in uniform, as I think all committee members have said, to all members of the defense team and to Canadians to get this right. And we'll continue working hard to do just that on top of all these initiatives. There's also been Bill C-65 with new regulations on prevention of harassment and violence in the workplace. Harassment and violence in the workplace, of course, in any form will not be tolerated. And that and amendments to the Canada Labor Code contained in the workplace harassment and violence prevention regulations came into effect on January 1st, 2021, and will expand the existing prevention of violence framework known as Bill C-65. These amendments will strengthen the provisions of the Canada Labor Code by putting in place one comprehensive approach that takes all forms of harassment and violence into consideration. This will help departments to better prevent, respond to, and support to those affected by harassment and violence in the federal public service. This new regulation will affect all D&D public service employees and the Canadian Armed Forces members who supervise them. The coordination and implementation of this new regulation is assigned to the ADM HR Civ as the functional authority for health and well-being of the public service employees within the department. And committee members have heard about harassment or sexual misconduct related to those employees, not just CAF members. So in short, this means that along with all of Government of Canada departments and agencies, their obligations with respect to harassment and violence in the workplace will increase. While we'll see more details in the coming weeks, some examples of what we will do under this new legislation include ensuring that a resolution process is in place and that issues are resolved in a timely and transparent manner, identifying the risk factors that contribute to harassment and violence in the workplace, and developing and implementing preventive measures to mitigate these risks, and developing harassment and violence training and ensure that all parties in the workplace, including employer, participate in this training. In parallel, the VCDS has been tasked with addressing potential changes to the CAF policies and programs for now DAOD 5012-0, harassment prevention and resolution, and the harassment prevention and resolution instructions, accessible only on the National Defense Network, will continue to apply to the CAF. Early in the new year, a working group will be stood up to conduct, that's this year, to conduct a holistic review of the CAF harassment framework in order to modernize and align it where possible with the Canadian Labour Code. The working group will also be tasked with looking at opportunities to streamline and align existing interrelated mechanisms and programs, so that as much as possible, the employees at D&D and the CAF members will be able to get will have very similar treatment and help. So existing programs, preventive measures, and support will remain in place to keep our defense team as much free as possible from physical and psychological harm. However, when harassment or violence does occur, we must work together to identify it, root it out, and take action to prevent reoccurrence. With this new legislation, the C-65 will help strengthen all our efforts on all fronts. And on then the other bill that we've brought in, again, to be fair, that things have been done and have been moving forward, is Bill C-77, an act to amend the National Defense Act, Declaration of Victims' Rights. This enactment amends the provisions of the National Defense Act governing the military justice system. It adds a new division entitled Declaration of Victim Rights to the Code of Service Discipline that specifies victims of service offenses have a right to information, protection, participation, and restitution in respect of service offenses. It adds or amends several definitions, including victim and military justice system participant, and specifies who may act on a victim's behalf for the purposes of that division. And I know that the Conservatives are very sensitive and supportive of victim rights. It amends Part 3 of that act to, among other things, specify the purpose of the Code of Service Discipline and of the fundamental purpose of imposing sanctions at summary hearings, protect the privacy and security of victims and witnesses in proceeding with involved certain sexual offenses, specify factors that a military judge is to take into consideration when determining whether to make an exclusion order, make testimonial ads more accessible to the vulnerable witnesses, allow witnesses to testify using a pseudonym in appropriate cases. We've all heard about potential retribution. And on application, make publication bans for victims under the age of 18 mandatory. In certain circumstances, require a military judge to inquire of the prosecutor if reasonable steps have been taken to inform the victims of any plea agreement entered into the accused and the prosecutor, providing that the acknowledgement of harm done to the victims and the community is a sentencing objective, provide for different ways of presenting victim impact statements, and allow the military impact statements and community impact assessments to be considered for all service offenses. To provide as a principle of sentencing that particular attention should be given to the circumstances of Aboriginal offenders. And as you know, there are provisions in the criminal code for that as well. Provide for the creation and regulations of service infractions that can be dealt with by summary hearing so that more cases can go forward.
Madam Chair, I'm calling a point of relevance here. This is completely off topic now. I believe that Mr. Bagnall's actually reading the draft report of Justice Fish that's been provided to the Department of Defense, and he's talking about military justice and service offenses, and that's all fine and good, but that's our next study. This isn't our study that we're working on right now. And I ask that he come back to point. And Madam Chair, I ask that you do try to direct debate so that it is on point and relevant to the amendment.
Well, Madam Chair, as I said earlier, I wouldn't have to be doing this if the member had not suggested on probably more than one occasion that nothing has been done. The terms of our committee, in fact, the terms of the motion start out to address sexual misconduct. And to say that nothing's been done is not accurate and not fair. And this is what we need to build on. And this is why we should not be debating a motion that doesn't really add to all. As you can see, I think all members who can see the motion before us, it does really nothing in relation to these serious advances forward. I'm almost finished them. I'm definitely not reading from a report, Mr. Fish, but I should have actually included the fact that we've done that into the things we've done. I'm not included that in my remarks, but I've not seen that report. I have no idea what's in it. So I'm definitely not reading from it. So I'm almost finished here, so I'll just continue to give credit where credit's due and to stop members from suggesting nothing's been done by the government, by CAF, and by DND, and a supportive minister. So it's also provide in the creation of regulations of service infractions that can be dealt with by summary hearing, as I said, to get more cases forward, to provide a scale of sanctions in respect of service infractions and for the principles applicable to those sanctions, to provide for a 6-month limitation period in respect of summary hearings, and to provide superior commanders, commanding officers, and delegated officers with jurisdiction to conduct a summary hearing in respect of a person charged with having committed a service infraction if the person is at least one rank below the officer conducting the summary hearing. Finally, the enactment makes related and consequential amendments to certain acts. Most notably, it amends the criminal code to include military justice system participants in the class of persons against whom offenses relating to intimidation of a justice system participant can be committed. Madam Chair, I think all this suggests strong, serious steps forward in attempts to, and in some cases helping, and will help. A lot of this work is underway right now, and people should know that. I think members of the committee will be appreciative of that. But that's why that to be serious, that our discussions, instead of dealing with the motion, and although I appreciate the amendment, it still keeps the inappropriate parts of the motion, the constantly recalling of witnesses to deal with an anonymous email that no one knew what was in because the person wanted it to be confidential, which they have every right to be, and get on with what the committee heard. And they heard was the 3 areas. And I think Yvonne and other committee members have a great understanding that it's the culture change, which is referred to in this motion, in the amendment. Unfortunately, it tied to a bad motion, but the good amendment by Mr. Barsu-Duval talks about culture, which is the important thing that if we're serious, we should be talking about. Instead of recalling witnesses that we've already had, we should be talking about the reprisals. And I'm not sure we've had enough discussion or recommendations. I may want to make some related to reprisals because I don't think it's hidden from anyone that one of the reasons that the reporting levels are so low is the fear of reprisals and fear of effect on a career in which your family sustenance depends on, in which you entered with great honor and you want to serve with great honor, and to then, for doing the right thing in reporting, you have a fear of being reprisal. Is that serious discussions that this committee is undertaking? And as is the third of the 3 major items, I think, or 3 of the major items at least, is the how these fit in the chain of command, which was also referred to in the Deschamps report, and what Madame Arbour hopefully will be providing a roadmap of how we deal with. But we could be making serious process on these issues as opposed to dealing with 4 of the survivors, which is where our focus should always be, instead of recalling witnesses, calling a witness who's was already spoken for, suggesting that the debate end at a certain time so that so that the recommendations could not be, some recommendations could be not debated. Who's going to take a report seriously where we could not debate or discuss recommendations? So I will leave it at that for now. I have a lot more when we get to the main motion to go into more detail on some of these areas, but I will pass that on for now. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bagnall. On to Madame Vandenbelt, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And before I begin, I just want to ensure that all committee members know, based on Mr. Bazan's earlier point of order intervention, that when there is a report tabled in Parliament, as Justice Fish's report will be soon, all members get that at the same time, and there will be technical briefings offered to members so that all members get access to that report. Nobody gets that ahead of time. So just to make sure that, as the member knows, that is the usual practice. So nobody on this, as Mr. Bagnall said, he is not reading from anything that is currently not yet tabled in the House. The other thing I'd just like to address before I get into my comments on the amendment to the motion is just to correct some of the statements that were made earlier today by opposition members, and just ensure that anybody who's watching doesn't get the wrong impression about what is happening in this committee. It was mentioned, I heard it said that there have been canceled meetings and meetings that have been cut short. And I'd just like to reassure anyone who's listening to the proceedings today, there have actually not been any meetings cut short beyond the scheduled time that the meeting.
Point of order, Madam Chair.
Ended. And
point of order, Madam Chair.
Go ahead, Mr. Garrison.
Well, I would ask all members of this committee to adhere the rules of honesty and integrity. And so when members intervene to say that what other members have said is
that's not a point of order.
It's not a debate.
And
it's not a debate.
I'm explaining.
If you will just let me finish my point of order, you will understand the point of order. So the point of order is that when members say that other members aren't speaking the truth, that's actually against the rules of the House. And that is my point of order. So you can have an opinion about what happens in committee, but you cannot say that other members are not speaking truthfully about what happens in the committee.
I do believe that my words were that I don't want anyone to get a wrong impression. So that was not any accusation against any member of this committee. And I would like the opportunity to lay out what my understanding is of what has been happening in the committee. And from my understanding, going back over the minutes and evidence of all of the meetings since this began, there haven't been any meetings that were ended before the scheduled time that the meeting was intended to end. And also there was only one meeting which one could potentially say was canceled. It was a meeting that was suspended at the insistence of the opposition because they didn't want the meeting to adjourn because they knew then we would come back and be able to put on the agenda debating the reports. So instead, insisting on suspending the meeting. And then it was events in the House. In fact, there was a motion in the House that superseded
Point of order,
the very
Madam Chair.
topic that.
Point of order, Madam Chair. The member persists in saying what other members think or what other members do. She's entitled to her opinions. She's not entitled to suggest what other members of this committee had as their motives or what inspired their actions. She can talk about her opinions and her views of what happened, but she is not entitled to ascribe opinions and views to other members of this committee. It is dishonorable conduct.
Madam Chair, I'm very surprised at the aggression that the member has pointed toward me. I'm simply laying out facts about different meetings that have happened, what time they ended, whether or not a meeting was canceled. There was a statement made earlier, and as I said, I want to ensure that anybody listening doesn't get the wrong impression about what has happened. The meeting that I was just referring to that one could say was technically a canceled meeting was in fact superseded because there was a motion in the House of Commons where that issue that the meeting was supposed to address was debated for 8 hours in the House of Commons that superseded the meeting. And that meeting was in fact suspended there was even an attempt at a motion to suspend. So, but just to go through the larger issue here. This was a study that originally was intended to be 3 or 4 meetings, and this study has now gone for 4 months. Our committee meets generally when the House is sitting. It meets for 2 meetings for 2 hours, so that's 4 hours a week. Our committee on this study alone, not only has it extended well beyond the number of meetings that were originally intended, but it has actually sat 26 hours and 40 minutes of additional time in addition to the time that the meetings were actually scheduled. There have been 5 emergency meetings that have been called in addition, again, to the regular scheduled time for these meetings. So I do believe that it would be logical to say that this particular study has had already more debate, more witnesses, more time than anything that had been anticipated. And I do believe that I don't want to leave the impression for viewers that, or anybody listening, that that any meetings have actually been canceled or been cut short. So that's just what I wanted to begin with. But I'd also like to, in addressing the amendment and the motion, because whether it's interim or whether it's a full report, the issue of adding more witnesses and hearing more, I do note that there are the same witnesses on this list that have already appeared. So what has happened, I believe, is that as we've progressed, each time that we're ready to review the report, each time we're ready to, and in fact have had scheduled meetings set to review the 3 reports, each time that has happened, there has been yet another motion put on the floor to call yet another witness or another set of witnesses. And I think that in each case, we have brought those witnesses. When there was an additional witness, Mr. Elder, we did hear from Mr. Elder, and then the Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister was called, and we did hear from her. We've heard from the Minister now for 6 hours, and he came in place of his Chief of Staff, Zita Estrabas, which at the time, and even Ms. Alislev said in her testimony a couple of meetings ago, that was accepted by the committee at the time. And so what my concern is that there is a narrative that has been put out there that somehow we're trying to stop witnesses. That is, as we can see, we have accepted all the witnesses that the members of the committee have asked, except for actually a few that were put by the opposition, like Jason Kenney and a couple others. But the fact is, every time there's another motion, and this particular motion, with or without the amendment that we're discussing, in fact, asks for no debate or amendments when we discuss the report. It asks for no response from the government, which is a normal practice and procedure. So what is happening now, I think, is that because we have accepted all of the witnesses that have been put forward, all the additional ones each time, and I am not attributing any motives here, but the perception could be made that these are poison pills deliberately put into these motions, knowing that members of the committee wouldn't be able to accept it and not get on with the report. And I would note, Madam Chair, that our next study is on military justice, and we do actually have Justice Fish about to table a very, very important review of the military justice system. I would implore one more time that if the opposition would like to try to find consensus, perhaps the opposition could withdraw the motion, which includes, as I said, things that say that, as by my calculation, an hour and 45 minutes to debate a report that's over 60 pages, and says right in it that there be no debate and no amendment, which is very undemocratic and a very difficult thing to do in a committee when we do need to look at the different parts of the report and make amendments, and also not asking for a government response. So what I would suggest is that if the opposition withdraws the motion or the amended motion, perhaps at that point we could then review the reports, and then we could move to the justice study right at the time that Justice Fish is going to be tabling, which gives us an incredible opportunity, because we would be able to call Justice Fish and then call other witnesses that can speak about an aspect of the sexual misconduct that is vitally important, that has been identified by almost every witness that we had here and that we had before the Status of Women Committee as a core issue in looking at whether or not there's justice for victims of sexual harassment, sexual assault, sexual misconduct in the military. And that is the military justice system. And so that's why I do believe that the comments about that are incredibly relevant, and why I believe we have an opportunity as members of Parliament who, and I've said this before, I believe that all members of this committee do want what's best for the women and men of the Canadian Armed Forces. I do believe that. And I would very much hope that we can put partisanship aside, see that we can look at the recommendations in this study that, frankly, there are many recommendations that come from testimony, important testimony. We had Madame Deschamps herself come to this committee. We have had experts. We have had academics. We have had people that have come in good faith testifying before us in the assumption that that testimony would then lead to something, that it would then lead to a report and recommendations. And I very much hope that we can still get to that. I do believe that regardless of whether we pass this motion, there will be another one and another one. We've seen that as a pattern at this point. I do believe that there are things in this motion that, deliberately or not, are things that the opposition knows can't be supported, including not having any amendments or debate on a very important report. So I would just really urge, Madam Chair, that members of the committee would really let's try to work together to at least still get this report out, to at least get the other two reports, and then hear some. We may not get a report on military justice before the end of the session, but we could hear some really important testimony. I know that if we could hear from Justice Fish, he will have some very, very important things to say that I do believe are relevant and vitally important to the survivors. I do want to talk more about military culture. I have a number of recommendations that you'll recall I was speaking of several weeks ago that actually came from the testimony and came from the survivors. I had a list of 92. I still have 27 left, but I will set that aside because I see other people would like to speak, and I will come back to those momentarily as soon as my colleagues have had a chance to speak. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right. Thank you, Madam Vandenbeld. Mr. Spengeman, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I'd like to thank my colleagues for their previous intervention, in particular Mr. Bagnall, who outlined the fact that the Government of Canada has taken substantial amounts of action. And I'd like to echo Ms. Vandenbeld's call for an effort to transcend partisanship and to really see this as probably the fundamentally most important report that this committee has an opportunity to issue in its recent history. I would like to compliment Mr. Bagnall's overview of government action with a very short intervention, Madam Chair, that takes us back to June 2019, just about 2 years ago, when the predecessor committee in the 42nd Parliament issued its report on improving diversity and inclusion in the Canadian Armed Forces. That report at the time was chaired by Stephen Fuhr, who was then the member of Kelowna Lake Country. And a number of members of the current committee were also participating in that study, including Mr. Bazan, Mr. Garrison, Ms. Gallant, Mr. Robillard, and I think as a guest appearance also by Mr. Aaron O'Toole, among others. I also had the privilege of serving on that committee. And that report, Madam Chair, was impactful. Of course, it happened prior to the most recent developments with respect to the former chiefs of defense staff, but there was a strong recognition by the committee across party lines that there was a fundamental issue with diversity and inclusion. I think all of us were very much engaged. There was no dissenting report issued. It was the committee speaking as a transpartisan committee, as I think in these kinds of cases is extremely important. And I would just like to use that as an impetus to direct colleagues to the possibility that we have in front of us of coming together and really making an impactful set of recommendations that will move the yardsticks. With respect to sexual assault, that wasn't a specific topic, but the report, as part of its study of diversity and inclusion, did make reference to gender issues very prominently. It addressed the Canadian Armed Forces quote-unquote sexualized culture. Colleagues had the opportunity to engage in questions relating to gender-based analysis and the GBA Plus framework that's being used in Canada. There were discussions and recommendations and text on facilitating diversity training and education, the engagement of men as important allies, and we've had testimony in this study by a male Canadian Forces serving officer who is an ally, who has spoken out, who is courageous. Questions with respect to the accountability of particularly senior leadership cadres were addressed in that report, the collection of data, the creation of supporting networks, all of which done, Madam Chair, in a nonpartisan way, with very much coordinated, directed attention across party lines on these very pressing issues. With respect to recommendations, there are some that are particularly salient because in some respects they echo precisely what the minister has told us that he's doing at the moment, and what we're seeing being reported in the media as one of the priorities. That's the then recommendation 13 of that committee, which states that the Government of Canada instruct senior leadership team members of the Canadian Armed Forces to implement a program that will ensure the sponsorship of promising female Canadian Armed Forces leaders as they progress through the ranks. And the minister has talked about this policy objective in the form of creating a pipeline that will allow women in significantly larger numbers to serve not only in the Canadian Forces as officers, but at senior levels in the Canadian Forces and ultimately as Chief of Defence Staff. With respect to unconscious bias training, I've made reference in the last session with respect to the UK experience on training questions, and sharpened that lens by putting forward some recommendations that have been helpful to the British government with respect to addressing this issue. But we also in 2019 made a recommendation that the Government of Canada make unconscious bias training available to all members of the Canadian Forces, and that this training be repeated as necessary pursuant to best practices established by knowledgeable experts. With respect to accountability of the senior leadership cadres, we recommended that the Canadian Forces explore options for holding senior leadership accountable for improving the representation of women and diverse groups. A fairly general recommendation that probably we would want to sharpen in light of the evidence that we've heard in this current study. Programs for men and women to learn about gender equality and diversity. That was a baseline recommendation. Again, something that we would probably want to amplify. This study was submitted, as I said, 2 years ago in June of 2019. Standard exit interviews were something that this committee recommended. And also with respect to data, that the Canadian Forces, with the assistance of relevant and knowledgeable organizations and academics, identify and maintain data on sexual assaults in all divisions, units, and other parts of the military. These are just some. There were others, Madam Chair, but I'm raising them to remind the committee of what is possible if we transcend a partisan approach. It's, in my view, not terribly helpful to come to the table with the presupposition that there's a cover-up, as was said a couple of times. In fact, it's the opposite. The minister, when he appeared, and the Prime Minister and the House have openly acknowledged that we need to do more for women and for all members of the Canadian Forces, that work is to be done, that the door is open, that the time for patience is over, if I'm quoting the minister correctly, and that complete and total cultural change is required. So it's really a message of giving the committee the latitude not to cover up, but to uncover the challenges, to uncover the systemic challenges, which in my view we are doing, but I would like to reinsert the argument that it needs to be proportional in light of the individual cases that have come forward. The committee is focused has been focused for a number of sessions, doing something that normally is done by the subcommittee, which is to discuss the names of additional witnesses. We're burning out time, and those colleagues on our side who are concerned with the recommendations are making the argument that this time is precious and that we need to focus on the substance of the pressing issue to make sure sure that the next case doesn't pop up. If all we do is put a Band-Aid in terms of inquiring and maybe getting some statements on the record with respect to how a particular case was handled or not handled, that in itself is important, but it doesn't solve the fundamental question of how to prevent the next case or how to create the accountability structures that the Canadian Forces so urgently need. Also, in light of the significant comparative experience elsewhere, I've said this again and again, I'm not raising other jurisdictions in my interventions, including the UK, because it's interesting to see that something else is going on elsewhere. I'm raising it to highlight the systematic nature of this issue across militaries. And that in itself reflects how deeply entrenched these questions are with respect to sexualized cultures, because gender equality for generations in the military has not been a priority. And we really need to get to a better place urgently, not over the next 10 years, but literally in very, very short order. Let me just, on that same note, Madam Chair, cite the conclusion from the 2019 report. And again, I want to thank colleagues who are with us today who served on that committee in the 42nd Parliament and who have done the hard work. And we did it very collaboratively. All of you will remember the testimony was tough. It took us aback in many ways. All of it preceded the most recent developments, which have further heightened the urgency and the significance of the problem. But I think we were all very much engaged and all very much on the same side of the table with respect to solving these questions. We concluded, Madam Chair, that report, I think on its final page, I think it was page 57, so a substantial report. And we said the following. We said, taken together, the overarching message from witnesses was one of culture change. Their focus was not only the difficulties in achieving and measuring it, but more so the urgent requirement for it. The Canadian Armed Forces has taken steps to promote inclusion and respect for diversity at home and abroad. In the words of Ms. Perron, and Ms. Perron here is referenced as Captain Retired Sandra Perron, the first female infantry officer of the Canadian Forces, and I'm quoting, "There's no doubt that the Canadian Armed Forces has veered towards making military culture more inclusive, more welcoming, and more valuing of diversity, but it's too slow. Veering is not enough. We need a hard right." And that's where the quote ends. And again, this hard right she called for in 2019, some 2 years before the most recent developments, even more urgent now. And to make that hard right, Madam Chair, we need to go through the recommendations. We need to analyze them. We need to prioritize them, pick the best ones, pick the ones that will achieve the most change most quickly, and not simply in one session sort of vote them up and down because we've burnt out the time fishing for witnesses for an additional sentence or two that may substantiate a prejudgment that some of us will have with respect to there being a cover-up. It's the opposite, again, Madam Chair, in my submission. The door's open for real recommendations, for real change, for a transpartisan approach, and to show the Canadian public that this committee really is seized with probably the most pressing question, as I said, in the recent history of the Canadian Forces, and is willing and able to come together and make recommendations that will take the country into a very different space in very short order. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Spengeman. Monsieur Robillard, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm all mixed now. Can you pass another one and I'll come back?
Sure, I can do that. Thank you.
Please.
Will do. Mr. Casey, you're up next.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. It's nice to be here to participate in this committee meeting. I'm here as a substitute, of course, for Mr. Baker, and I expect that if Mr. Baker was here, you'd have a much more eloquent intervention as someone as knowledgeable as he is. I do bring a bit of an outsider's perspective to the specific topic at hand, but some experience in terms of matters of procedure, and there's a few things that kind of sink in after 10 years in this place. So I know that Mr. Bazan is quite preoccupied that we make sure that we're speaking to the amendment and to the motion, and that the bounds of relevance be kept fairly tight. So I'm actually going to start with the amendment that has been proposed. So the amendment indicates that the scope of the study will likely lead to new facts. And in the second subparagraph indicates that the committee believes that a report is urgently needed to put an end to the culture that has existed within the Canadian Armed Forces, and then calls for the presentation of an interim report, which will allow for some action to be taken as the more fulsome report is delivered. And the first thing that strikes me on this is the inconsistency, quite frankly, between the amendment and the main motion. The amendment talks about urgency, but the main motion is to prolong the witness list. I would think that if we adopt the amendment and adopt the theory that this is urgent, that we wouldn't be extending the witness list 4 months into a report. I guess the other thing that I would offer is, again, based on 10 years experience in parliamentary committees, it has been my experience that at the outset of a study, witnesses are suggested by each of the parties, they're prioritized, and that they are then ranked in a manner that is consistent with the parties standing in the House or in the committee. This is, I think, a tradition that goes across all 22 standing committees of Parliament, one that certainly I've seen observed and respected on the committees that I've served over the years, including the one that I chair now, the Standing Committee on Human Resources, Skills and Social Development and the Status of Persons with Disabilities. And there's good logic behind this. If the witnesses can be identified and prioritized at the outset, a work plan can be developed. And as they say, you plan the work and then you work the plan. When there is 4 months into a study, when there is additional witnesses demanded that presumably didn't go through that original process, it's once again it's hard to understand that there is a true appreciation for the urgency of the issue when it continues in this fashion. The amendment talks about and talks to the culture. And certainly in recent months, Canadians have heard the heart-wrenching accounts of Canadian Armed Forces members and civilian colleagues who've been the subject of behaviors, treatment, and experience that are completely unacceptable. And as the amendment points out, for far too long, their accounts have been ignored. For instance, the opposition knew of rumors against General Vance in 2015, but still appointed him. They appointed him when there was an active Canadian Forces National Investigation Service investigation into him, and appointed him to the most senior position within the Canadian Armed Forces. The current leader of the official opposition says he passed along sexual misconduct rumors about General Vance in 2015 and claimed that those were looked into. So I think that begs the question, how is it possible that General Vance was appointed at the same time and the investigation was suddenly dropped? Now, there's no question that what members have endured is wrong, The Canadian Armed Forces is entrusted to keep Canadians safe, both at home and abroad. The organization owes survivors more. Every Canadian Armed Forces member makes enormous personal sacrifices to protect Canadians, and regardless of rank or gender identity, they have an undeniable right to serve in safety. The urgency of this issue, the urgency of the need for culture change is identified in the amendment, and properly so. The Department of National Defence and Canadian Armed Forces have to live up to this expectation. The Minister has always followed the processes put in place. We've heard that repeatedly. He has always followed the processes put in place when allegations were brought to his attention. This is something that he has always done and that he will continue to do. Our government's taking important steps, unlike the allegation that nothing has been done, that no steps have been taken, to build on the points made by my friend from the Yukon. We're taking important steps to address systemic misconduct within the Canadian Armed Forces and to bring about the culture change that is referenced in the amendment and the culture change that is needed in the organization. The need to change the military's culture is born of the reality that the lived experiences of many defense team members are completely out of line with the values professed by the organization. These are values of integrity, of inclusion, and accountability. That needs to change, and we as a government are committed to bringing about this change. If we want that change to be significant, meaningful, and to last, then we need to reflect honestly on what's been happening. Where we find failings and fault, we must accept responsibility. Like in the case of the current leader of the official opposition. And by the opposition's logic, should he be fired for hearing a rumor of misconduct against General Vance? Because as we know, just days after the former government appointed General Vance, the investigation was closed. According to the Access to Information request, the commanding officer said he was under, quotes, pressure. Who do they think applied that pressure? Where we're able to learn lessons, we must seize the opportunity to build a better organization. Where members of the defense team share their accounts and experiences, we must listen and listen carefully. Which also brings me to the main motion and the inconsistency with the urgency of the need to have a culture change. The main motion calls for the presentation of a report without a request for a response from government. Is this seriously a motion that respects the urgency, or that respects the need to ensure that there are no further victims when there is no response requested from government? Or is it something else? The end goal should be simple. Where we hope to get to is to ensure that every member of the defense team is valued and respected. Defense culture and professional conduct must reflect the core values and ethical principles our military aspires to uphold as a national institution. And that's why Canadian Armed Forces members, veterans, recruits, public servants, and Canadians expect and deserve of the organization. Recently, the Minister of National Defence announced the creation of a new organization to lead us there, and we heard Mr. Bagnall refer to this. Among other initiatives, the Department of National Defence appointed Lieutenant General Jenny Kerrigan as the Department of National Defence new Chief Professional Conduct and Culture. It's hard to imagine a better person to lead this important initiative. Under her leadership, the Professional Conduct and Culture Organization will unify, integrate, and coordinate all the policies, programs, and activities that address systemic misconduct and support culture change within the forces. And this new organization will include a new Assistant Deputy Minister who will directly support her. The team will bring together members from all ranks and classifications, reflecting the diversity that Canadians expect. But make no mistake, this is not a generic pre-packaged solution to a long-standing problem. Before any future steps are taken, those working to bring about change will actively listen to the accounts of people affected, people at every rank, people at every level, and people in every installation across all regions of the country. Members of the Professional Conduct and Culture Change Organization will honor each person's experiences, respect each person's individuality, and will neither judge nor assume. They will listen so that people's lived experiences guide the road to eliminating discrimination, biases, harmful stereotypes, and systemic barriers. As so many members of the defense team have already shared their experiences and recommendations, we don't need to wait before implementing a number of much needed changes. Lieutenant General Carignan and her team will take a number of steps to bring about that change now. To start, they'll wrap up Operation Honor. Much has already been said about drawing this initiative to a close, but it bears repeating. Lieutenant General Carignan and her team will review all of the research conducted under Operation Honor so that its findings can inform renewed culture change efforts. This new team will develop mechanisms to implement the workplace harassment and violence prevention regulations of Bill C-65, which was also mentioned by Mr. Bagnall, and will support the ongoing efforts to bring the remaining provisions of Bill C-77 into force, and that will include the Declaration of Victims' Rights into the National Defense Act. The next order of business will be for the team to establish a framework that will help achieve a number of longer-term goals. They will realign responsibilities, policies, and programs that address elements of systemic misconduct across national defense and the forces. They will also simplify and enhance misconduct reporting mechanisms, including for people outside of the chain of command. They will also give greater agency to and strengthen support mechanisms for those who have experienced misconduct. They will enhance tracking mechanisms from initial reports of misconduct to case closures. And they'll integrate additional data points such as intersectionality, reprisals, member satisfaction, and retention. And finally, they will lead institutional efforts to develop a professional conduct and culture framework that tackles all types of harmful behavior, biases, and systemic barriers. So much work to build healthy, safe, and inclusive workplaces is already being done within the department. So many organizations are focused on developing programs and policies that move us in the right direction. Among them, GBA Plus, the Integrated Conflict and Complaint Management Program, the Anti-Racism Secretariat, the Canadian Armed Forces Diversity Strategy, Canada's Anti-Racism Strategy, Canada's National Action Plan for Women, Peace and Security. The Professional Conduct and Culture team will work with the people leading each of those efforts to further their good work. And they will make the most of ongoing consultations, conversations, external and independent reviews, and analysis to inform the way ahead. The Professional Conduct and Culture Organization is being established with the clear understanding that previous culture change efforts have fallen far short of what was needed. And this, of course, is acknowledged in the amendment that is the subject of this discussion today. As Lieutenant General Carignan has said, those efforts were fractured, which resulted in segmented efforts and piecemeal changes. With the standing up of this new organization, the defense team is taking a fundamentally different approach. As Lieutenant General Carignan also said, the new approach will be a more holistic and coherent way to address the complex challenges faced by the Canadian Armed Forces. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge Canada's good fortune at having such a decorated leader like Lieutenant General Carignan leading this vital initiative. With 30 years of military experience, she served in operations around the world. Most recently took on a tremendous leadership role as the commander of the NATO mission in Iraq from November of 2019 to November of 2020. She's been invested as a commander of the Order of Military Merit and is the recipient of the Meritorious Service Medal, earned as a result of her exceptional commitment to our armed forces, its missions, and our country. Reading her professional biography is an exercise in humility. In addition to an exceptional work ethic, she brings a profound understanding of military best practices to this role and has already shown herself to be a truly gifted leader. I would like to reiterate our deepest concern for the well-being of every member of the defense team. The standing up of the Professional Conduct and Culture Organization is a testament to our government's genuine commitment to the defense team. We have shown that we are dedicated to creating a lasting culture change across the defense team. We will do just that. And I trust that these remarks were of some value to these deliberations. Thank you for the time, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Casey. Monsieur Robillard, s'il vous plaît.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to apologize to my colleagues for the technical glitch. We must learn from those who were left behind, and we must listen to them. We must bring about change that really take into account their needs and their diverse backgrounds. Not long ago, the Minister of National Defense announced the launch of an independent and comprehensive review of the CAF and national defense. This is a step in the right direction. And I think that we should endeavor to work towards that direction and to examine these recommendations instead of inviting more witnesses. Professional conduct in the Defense Department must reflect ethical principles that we want to respect as a national institution. That is what members, veterans, recruits, civil servants, and Canadians expect. And that is what they deserve. We each have the personal responsibility to create a workplace free from violence, harassment, and all forms of discrimination. And the Director of Culture will ensure that these principles are respected. Changes will take place across the Canadian Armed Forces and the Defense Department, which will benefit from a center of expertise to help those who are victim to misconduct. And the center will be directed by Jenny Carignan, and she will be directly supported by an assistant as well as a team that will be well qualified and will endeavor to reflect the diversity of Canadians. The measures that will be adopted to foster cultural change will be informed by what we have learned, listening to those affected by misconduct. We will be careful to listen to people from all ranks and from all corners of the country. Their lived experiences and their suggestions will make it possible to guide different measures, solutions, and decisions regarding culture change in order to put an end to stereotypes, prejudice, misconduct, and other systemic problems. The team will work together with various groups at the DND and the CAF that are already working on improving their workplaces to make them safer and more inclusive. They are carrying out external independent reviews, consultations, research, are drawing from expertise and strategies and consider gender-based analysis plus. The complaint mechanisms are being examined. We will integrate and implement the recommended changes announced by Louise Arbour, including the recommendations and the temporary assessments. The Center for the Sexual Misconduct Resource Center is mentioned in Budget 2021, which allocates funds to strengthen our efforts to fight sexual misconduct and gender-based violence in the Canadian Armed Forces, and funds to support survivors. More details will be released over the coming weeks. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Robillard. On to Mr. Spengeman, please.
Madam Chair, thank you. Thank you very much. Colleagues, I think a couple of sessions ago, I was in the course of bringing you portions of the British experience with respect to two things, really. One is their approach to getting ahead of inappropriate behavior in the British Armed Forces, and then also the correction in the approach to deal with inappropriate behavior when it has occurred. Again, I raised the British experience as illustrative of the systematicity across, as I've said, a number of militaries across the world that we work very closely with, be it through NATO or the United Nations or in other coalitions. But also because the British experience in particular that I started with, there are other countries, has been illuminating. It's, again, not just something that's interesting, that's occurring in parallel. It is something that's directly relevant to our work. And some of the recommendations are issues that we have not dealt with, have not looked at. So in the context of the motion and the amendment makes specific reference to new facts coming before the committee. New facts can come in the form of witness testimony, but they can also come in the form of documentary evidence and reports, and specifically work that's being done on the very same issue elsewhere in the world is extremely relevant. And the main motion, in fact, in its original form, I believe if I have this right, was to cut short our work on the 28th at 2:45 p.m. And thereafter go directly to a vote on the recommendation. So I'm struggling a bit because I think there are some relevant passages in the work that the UK Armed Forces have done, but other jurisdictions as well. So I'm going to try to get some of that on the record over the sessions that we have prior to the formulation of what I hope will be an all-party report, not an interim report in my view, but a report that is substantive and that has the recommendations that are required to achieve change as early as this summer. So the UK Armed Forces, and the report has the title "Report on Inappropriate Behaviors," plural, and it was actually released a month after we released our parliamentary report in the 42nd Parliament that I referred to a couple of interventions ago. So the committee then did not have the benefit of this experience in its deliberation, but we do now. So let me, Madam Chair, let me get into some of the recommendations. They deal with a number of issues related to training, related to a concept that the British Armed Forces refer to as reverse mentorship, which I believe we have not looked at, but also very importantly deals with the role of bystanders. And we've heard again and again testimony from witnesses in front of this committee that we need to find ways to give serving members of the armed forces or civilian members who are bystanders to sexual misconduct and inappropriate conduct, the mechanisms that will give them the confidence to speak out and speak up and become change agents. So the UK proceeds with the premise very straightforward: we must do more to stop instances of inappropriate behavior occurring. A lot of the attention that we've given has gone to mechanisms of reporting inappropriate behavior that has occurred, and there may well be inappropriate behavior that has not been reported yet. In fact, the evidence suggests that trend is very much there until the culture has changed. But the UK analysis says, okay, what, in addition to having proper reporting mechanisms, what else can we do to get ahead of the problem? So to make sure that ultimately there are no cases that are being reported, not because serving members are afraid to or don't have the confidence to speak out, but because no sexual misconduct has occurred. And that, of course, is the end state that we all aspire to. So this part of the UK report considers how we should better prepare the workforce, setting the tone and giving people the skills they need to prevent inappropriate behaviors from occurring. It is principally the responsibility of the single services and civil service senior leadership, and a significant amount of work in the UK is underway already. In compiling the reports, we identified the latest thinking and leading practice from professional bodies, academia, and other external organizations, including allied armed forces. And I made reference a couple of sessions ago to the fact that the UK actually cited us in one of their recommendations, cited work that had been done by the Canadian forces. So there is a need for collaboration and exchanging of best practices and solutions. This is about changing the level of tolerance and cultural acceptance of inappropriate behavior across every part of defense and at every level. It'll require concerted effort and persistent attention. Success will be measured in years, not weeks. This is a line that we may take issue with. The minister was very clear. He said the time for patience is over. We want progress quicker and not measured in years, but in weeks, if not months. But in any event, preparing the workforce is a crucial aspect of this, and the workforce includes the entirety of the defense sector. If a team enjoys good leadership, then unacceptable behaviors such as bullying, harassment, and discrimination within the team will not be tolerated. Leadership is the turnkey to set conditions for improvement in behavior across defense. It creates an environment in which our people, military and civilian, have faith in a chain of command at every level, share a clear understanding of what is appropriate behavior, and are empowered to call it out when it is not. Leaders set the tone through role modeling, self-awareness of their own attitudes and biases, and in developing cultural intelligence and understanding of the whole force. Real-time feedback to leaders, especially from those more junior personnel within the organization, is important and can be enabled through the use of reverse mentoring, 360-degree reporting, and focus groups. Reverse mentoring, by the way, Madam Chair, for those of us who are coming across the concept for the first time, is traditionally mentorship goes from a more senior member of an organization to a more junior member, whether it's in academia or in the private sector or in the civil service. This is the opposite. This is putting a junior member of the serving forces in a mentorship relationship with a senior member to provide feedback, to provide experience, lived experience, to provide understanding, thinking that may not be apparent to, or that the senior member may not have been exposed to the extent that she or he needs to in order to be a change manager within the organization. It's an innovative concept. I believe this committee may well want to turn its attention to its usefulness in our report. For the last 2 years, the Royal Navy has operated a diversity and inclusion action group, and the Royal Air Force has recently established a diversity and inclusion shadow board. Some Army units have similarly adopted this approach through the creation of regimental inclusion councils. as a mechanism to capture behaviors and feedback to the commanding officer. And this inclusive approach is especially effective in reflecting perspectives from junior cohorts. And Madam Chair, we've heard with respect to the Canadian Forces again and again that there is a generational divide. The problem is one that really differentiates senior ranks within the chain of command from junior and also middle ranks. So this initiative complements the Army Empowerment Program, which seeks to delegate authority to more junior levels of command and thereby achieves culture change. The recommendation that follows this analysis is that the services sustain and promote connected leadership in their training and preparation of leaders. Feedback mechanisms such as reverse mentors, focus groups, and 360-degree reporting are leading practice and should be maximized. The report then makes reference to a concept. I'm not sure if we've gotten the nomenclature or identified nomenclature for this within our work, but they call it referent others. This is, they're saying academic research refers to the most visible and influential members of a group or community as referent others. These include leaders, instructors, and others in authority. Their behavior not only has a disproportionate effect on the construction and propagation of the norm, but they are also important agents for sustaining the culture of an organization. So looking at leaders within defense, not necessarily just in the form of the chain of command, but looking at trainers, looking at external advisors, looking at instructors as referent others, as people who can perpetuate the norm is a key component to achieving culture change. They are the multipliers, they are the amplifiers of norms. And this is, I think, the granularity that we need to get to in our report. We need to find those spots within the Canadian Forces where these kinds of approaches and models are useful. The chain of command is one consideration, a very important one. This is a broader concept that the UK forces have identified and highlighted in this observation, that identification, education, and preparation of referent others, given their contribution to organizational culture, is a key component. With respect to prevention of inappropriate behavior, and this is really where the rubber hits the road in terms of our work, the UK report states that our armed forces understand the risk faced on operations and the individual judgments we ask of our people, even of life and death. The unique nature of military life introduces risks away from the battlefield too, and the risk of inappropriate behavior is one of them. Experience points to risk factors that are a recurring feature of instances of unacceptable behavior, particularly, Madam Chair, in cases of bullying and sexual harassment, tight-knit units that perceive themselves as elites, masculine cultures with low gender diversity, rank gradients, age gradients, weak or absent controls, especially after extensive operational periods, and alcohol. Unchecked and unrecognized, the combination of some of or all of these risk factors set the conditions for inappropriate behaviors to occur. To stop this, people in every part of defense, not just the leaders and the line managers, need to recognize the risk and have the good judgment to do something about it. And we may add to that not only the good judgment, but also the empowerment and the recognition that if they choose to take that step, their careers and their reputations are protected, if not enhanced, because they took that step. The judgment we expect of our people on the battlefield must be the same level of judgment we expect of their behavior in the barrack block or the bar or defense headquarters or anywhere else. Cultures and behaviors training has to bolster that judgment. It has to be relevant for the people involved and offer skills and techniques which people can use to good effect. Current cultures and behaviors training focus largely on service values and standards and the Civil Service Code, complemented by diversity and inclusion training. This gives the impression that it is done to maintain organizational compliance with the law and with service values, standards, and codes, which in some areas have developed into a tick box attitude. Madam Chair, this is incredibly relevant analysis. I think, again, this is the granularity we need to get to. It's easy to recommend training programs. It's easy to put money into training programs. It's also easy to say we've trained X hundreds of people. But unless we achieve the impact that is described in the level of analysis that we have here from the United Kingdom, these efforts will fall flat and will not lead to the culture change that we need to work for very, very actively and very progressively and quickly. To change cultures and improve behaviors, the report continues, training needs to be set in context. It needs to be well-timed and personally impactful for the participants with a clear set of outcomes. Key intervention periods are at career inception and subsequent confirmatory command, management, and promotion training courses. Training referent others to exhibit new behaviors and implicitly encourage adoption by their peers has proven effective at changing norms and behaviors in some hard-to-reach groups. Training must also take a preventative view to help leaders at every level better understand the early signs and symptoms of a systemic degradation of behaviors. I'm going to close with a recommendation on this portion of the report, Madam Chair, but I'll come back with additional interventions on this. And also,
go ahead, Mr. Barcelou-Duval.
Would it be possible to ask Mr. Spangman to slow down? Because the interpreter has let us know that she's having a difficulty keeping up with the text being read because they do not have a copy. Perhaps Mr. Spangman could even send them the text.
Mr. Barcelou-Duval.
Thank you very much. That's very much appreciated. I will slow down so that interpreters can continue service. Thank you.
I was on a point leading to a recommendation in the UK reports on training. And the report just prior to that recommendation states that training needs to take a preventative view. It needs to help leaders at every level better understand the early signs and symptoms of systemic degradation of behaviors. So not only delivering training in a top-down fashion, but actually making the training agile enough to pick up the behavior that it is supposed to address. The recommendation that the British report makes is that all recruits should receive immersive culture and behavior training at the start of service and continued at regular intervals throughout their career. And the British Army has made use of the Garnet Foundation to facilitate respect for others training informed by the chain of command. This is scenario-based, integrative, and highly regarded training, but it's also been subjected to funding pressures and it remains at risk. So the run-on recommendation by the UK is that the use of third-party training expertise is considered a leading practice and should be resourced and exploited across the UK Defence Forces. Madam Chair, there's another section I wanted to get to, but I'll leave it here for the moment. The next issue that I wanted to deal with, again, with highly relevant recommendations and analyses and insights is on bystanders, as I've mentioned. To achieve culture change, we have to address the issue of bystander empowerment. And again, there are segments of this report that this committee will find relevant and potentially may adopt in whole or in part. But with respect to training, I think we've seen that, the reflex for any government is to say, okay, let's train our way out of the problem. Training is an important baseline approach, and we've made recommendations on training in the previous report on diversity and inclusion. But it's to make sure that the training has the granularity, the sensitivity to behavior on the ground, the feedback mechanisms to see if it's actually working. And then to insert organizational change agent, as the UK has identified as referent others in key positions, regardless of rank. A referent other can be somebody who's a civilian instructor, an academic that works closely with the armed forces, or a serving member, and not necessarily of a certain rank, but potentially could also be somebody who commands respect through a role within the Canadian Forces who's of middle or junior rank, empowering those women and men to play their roles with respect to training and to empower others in turn to speak out against misconduct. So I think really valuable insights and recommendations with respect to the question of eliminating sexual misconduct in the first place. The complement to that, of course, is adequate reporting mechanisms to report instances that are still going on. And I'll have more to say on that in future interventions, Madam Chair. I'll leave it there for now and turn it back to you and to colleagues. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Spangman. On to Madame Vandenbelt, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I would like to address my intervention to Section B of the amendment on the motion, which I as I've said before, I do applaud Mr. Barcelou-Duval for focusing on the culture. Section B specifically talks about putting an end to the culture that has persisted for too long within the CAF in order to prevent women and men from becoming new victims of sexual misconduct. And this particular part of the amendment, I think is very, very important. We have been discussing, particularly in this committee, what happens after there has been an incident, after someone has been victimized, after somebody who has been harmed. But really what we need to do is prevent the harm from happening in the first place. And that's why I am very pleased to see that. Unfortunately, it's an amendment on a motion that obviously is very difficult to support. But I would like to talk a little bit about how we do that prevention. Because it is one thing to have supports in place when you have a person who has gone through a very difficult and traumatic experience. But in order to prevent it, you really need to address the culture. You really need to address the values, what it is that is valued and promoted within the Canadian Armed Forces, what characteristics and what skill sets are valued. And I said this actually in the Status of Women Committee, but I think it bears repeating here that all too often there's an attitude of, well, you know, he's a womanizer, but he's a good soldier or aviator or sailor. That does not exist. We need to make sure that the qualities of a good soldier, a good sailor, a good aviator, that the qualities include the kinds of qualities that allow leaders within the Canadian Armed Forces to draw out the best talent, the best skills, the best of everybody who serves and who is serving under them. And that requires a completely different value set. That requires us to look at the promotion system, at how we advance people within the Canadian Armed Forces, because those are the types of things. If you advance based on certain hard skills and you look at the leadership skills, the team building skills, the empathy, the understanding, and as peripheral, or worse yet, if you look at behaviors that can be very toxic, behaviors that can undermine and diminish and condescend and make people feel unwelcome, and treat those behaviors as peripheral to the skill set that you're looking at, that is something that is it is harmful. And so I think that Section B of the amendment really addresses the core of the issue. And it also addresses why we need to get on to the military justice study, because for so much of this, it is a matter of ending impunity. When people see that there are consequences to negative behaviors, when people see that the kinds of characteristics and skill sets that are rewarded include the kinds of skill sets that facilitate inclusion, that ensure that every single member is not just ending harm, but that they're thriving, that there is an environment in which everybody feels that they are fully and completely equal and that they are valued. Those are the kinds of things that you advance. But on the corollary of that, the kinds of behaviors, the kinds of characteristics that are causing the culture of toxic masculinity, what we heard from a number of our witnesses, the normative warrior culture, which is very harmful. That is the kind of thing that we also need to make sure is that there is justice, that there is not impunity when those kinds of things occur. And so that's why I am actually very pleased that
All right, this meeting is suspended. Dispendu. Thank you.